In the moment before a structure falls, before the wall cracks, before the foundation shifts, before the life you have carefully constructed begins to show its seams, there is a silence that the body knows before the mind does. Something tightens in the chest, the breath grows shallow. A sensation not unlike dread, but older than any specific fear, moves through the organism like a current. You have felt this. Every human being who has lived long enough has felt this, and in that suspended instant, before the collapse has fully arrived, the oldest question reasserts itself. Why must things fall apart at all? This is not a question that modern civilization has answered well. The prevailing frameworks offered to people navigating disintegration tend toward either the therapeutic, loss as wound requiring healing, collapse as pathology requiring correction, or the simply stoic, endure, persist, move forward. Both of these responses, whatever their partial utility, fundamentally misread the nature of what is happening when a life, an identity, a relationship, or a self-concept comes undone. They treat dissolution as aberration. The Western alchemical tradition, by contrast, understood dissolution as law. Solve et coagula. The phrase appears carved into the stone arms of the androgynous figure of Baphomet in certain esoteric illustrations, written upward along one forearm and downward along the other, as though the very body of the symbolic figure embodies the oscillating rhythm of the cosmos. Dissolve and coagulate, break down and build up, separate and unite. It is perhaps the most succinct formulation of a principle that the alchemists regarded not as metaphor, not as poetic shorthand, but as the actual operative law governing all transformation, material, psychic, and spiritual alike. To understand this formula is to understand something essential, not only about the history of alchemy, but about the structure of every genuine change you have ever undergone or will ever undergo. The men and women who labored in the alchemical tradition, from the Alexandrian proto-chemists of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, through the Arab transmitters of the classical heritage, through the great European operators of the medieval and Renaissance periods, were engaged in an enterprise that their contemporaries often regarded as either fraudulent or delusional. They claimed to be able to transmute base metals into gold, to manufacture an elixir capable of indefinitely prolonging life, to produce from common matter a substance so refined and so potent that it could perfect whatever it touched. Taken literally, these claims were largely false, as centuries of failed laboratory operations made increasingly obvious. But taken literally was never quite the right way to take them. Gerhard Dorn, the 16th-century Swiss alchemist and physician, was explicit about what he understood the work to actually involve. The transformation of metals, he wrote, was a veil, a deliberately obscure symbolic language designed to describe and transmit knowledge about an inner process, a process of psychological and spiritual refinement that used the imagery of the laboratory as its vehicle of expression. Heinrich Kunrath, writing in his Amphitheatrum Sapientiae Aeternae at the end of the same century, surrounded his extraordinary emblematic engravings with Latin inscriptions making the same point. The oratorium precedes the laboratorium. Prayer, interior work, introspection, the patient engagement with one's own depths, comes before any operation on outer material. The laboratory is the outer face of an inner temple. Carl Gustav Jung spent decades of his intellectual life documenting this interpretive tradition and elaborating its psychological implications. His work in Mysterium Conjunctionis, in Psychology and Alchemy, in Alchemical Studies, represents perhaps the most sustained and rigorous attempt in the modern period to recover what the alchemical corpus was actually saying beneath its deliberately obscure surface. What he found and what he documented with exhaustive care was a symbolic system of extraordinary precision and depth, a map of the processes by which the human psyche moves from fragmentation toward integration, from unconscious compulsion toward conscious self-possession, from the prima materia of ordinary, unexamined life towards something the alchemists called the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone. And at the center of this entire map, recurring across centuries and across wildly different cultural contexts, was the same two-word formula, solve et coagula. To grasp what this formula means at its deepest level of operation, it is necessary to first understand what the alchemists meant by the two operations it names. Solutio, dissolution, the solve, refers to the process by which a substance is broken down into its constituent elements, separated from the form it currently holds, returned to a state of relative undifferentiation. In the laboratory, this might involve dissolving a solid in acid, melting a metal in extreme heat, or fermenting an organic substance until its organized structure gave way to something more fluid and primordial. The imagery associated with solutio in alchemical texts is consistently aqueous and dark, floods, drowning, the dissolution of all solid form in a universal solvent, the return of matter to the state of prima materia, the first or raw matter, the undifferentiated substrate that precedes all formed things. Coagulatio, coagulation, the coagula, refers to the complementary movement, the gathering of what has been dispersed, the crystallization of a new form from the dissolved substrate, the emergence of a structure that is more refined, more essential, and more coherent than what was dissolved. In the laboratory, this might involve the precipitation of a solid from a solution, the cooling of a molten substance into a new crystalline form, or the emergence of a purified compound from a process of distillation and recombination. The imagery is solar, ascending, luminous, the dawn after darkness, the stone that forms from the chaos of dissolved matter, the new form that consolidates what the dissolution made available. The formula names these two operations in sequence, but this sequencing conceals something important. They are not simply two phases of a linear process. They are a rhythm, a pulse, a law of alternation that recurs at every level of the work, and that, crucially, never finally resolves into a stable endpoint from which no further dissolution is required. Solve et coagula is not a recipe with a fixed endpoint. It is a description of how transformation actually moves, not in a straight line from worse to better, but in a spiral in which every genuine advance requires a prior letting go, every new form requires the dissolution of whatever preceded it. Every consolidation contains within it the seed of a future necessary dissolution. This is the first thing that makes the formula genuinely disturbing to the modern sensibility. We have been educated by culture, by religion, by the entire orientation of progressive civilization, to understand improvement as accumulation, as the adding of knowledge, of skill, of capability, of understanding. The alchemical view inverts this. Genuine transformation is not primarily additive, it is primarily subtractive, or more precisely, it involves a dissolution of what one currently is before what one might become can emerge. You cannot pour new wine into old wineskins, as the Gospel puts it. The vessel itself must be reconstituted. The form itself must dissolve. The psychological implications of this principle are considerable, and they become visible with particular sharpness when one examines what actually happens in the periods of a human life that are later recognized as having been genuinely transformative. Consider the phenomenology of such periods, not as they are remembered afterward, when they have been integrated into a coherent narrative and invested with retrospective meaning, but as they are actually lived in the midst of their unfolding. A marriage ends, a career collapses, A belief system that has organized an entire life is exposed as insufficient. A capacity for self-deception, long maintained with considerable effort, finally gives way. A relationship with a parent, reconstructed again and again across decades in forms that preserved a necessary fiction, is finally seen for what it actually was. In each of these cases, what is being dissolved is not simply an external circumstance. What is being dissolved is a form of self, a particular organization of identity, of meaning, of investment, of understanding, that has constituted who the person believes themselves to be. This is why such periods are experienced with the specific quality of fear and vertigo that they carry. It is not merely that things are difficult or uncertain. It is that the self, who would ordinarily navigate difficulty and uncertainty, is itself the thing that is coming undone. The dissolution is reflexive. The acid acts on the vessel as well as on what the vessel contains. The alchemists encoded this recognition in the concept of the prima materia, the raw material, the first matter, the substance from which the great work begins. The prima materia was understood to be both the starting point of the opus and, in a deeper sense, its constant companion and recurrent challenge. It was described in deliberately paradoxical terms. It was everywhere and nowhere, the most common of substances and the most difficult to find, worthless in appearance and infinitely precious in essence. Paracelsus described it as the thing that all men seek, but that no man recognizes when he finds it, because it presents itself not in the form of treasure, but in the form of refuse, the thing cast aside, the thing regarded as waste, the thing that has no apparent value in the economy of ordinary life. Psychologically, the prima materia is everything in oneself that has been denied, suppressed, devalued, or cast into shadow, the aspects of character, impulse, and experience that the ego has refused to integrate because they do not conform to the self-image one has constructed and wishes to maintain. The prima materia is not something external to be sought. It is always already present in the form of the very qualities, reactions, obsessions, fears, and desires that one most consistently avoids confronting. The work begins, as it must begin, not with a noble ascent, but with a descent into what has been most thoroughly rejected. This is the stage the alchemists called the nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, the first operation of the great work. It is associated with the color black, with lead, with Saturn, with death and decomposition, with the dissolution of all formed structure into something dark and undifferentiated. In the laboratory, the nigredo was the phase in which the original substance was subjected to the operations that would reduce it to its first matter, to something that appeared on all external evidence to be utterly ruined, charred, rotted, reduced to ash and slag. From the outside, the substance at this stage of the work looks like destruction, not transformation. There is no visible evidence that anything valuable is taking place. The psychological nigredo is the experience of collapse that does not yet carry within it any visible seed of what will follow. It is the period in which the self-concepts and identity structures that have organized a life come apart, and the person undergoing this dissolution experiences it as loss, as failure, as breakdown, as the simple ruin of what they had built and been. The philosophical architecture of the self undergoes a kind of forced demolition. The beliefs that have given life its shape, beliefs about who one is, about what one deserves, about how the world operates, about what one's suffering means, are stripped of their persuasive force by the experience itself. What remains, in the depth of the nigredo, is the prima materia, raw, unformed, dark, undirected. The person does not yet know what they are. They know only what they are no longer. This is the experience that the mystical traditions of many cultures have described under various names. The dark night of the soul, the descent to the underworld, the 40 days in the wilderness, the death of the old Adam before the resurrection of the new. What the alchemical tradition adds to these formulations is a precise insistence on the necessity of this phase. It is not an aberration from the path. It is not a detour or a delay or a punishment. It is the path. The dissolution is not opposed to the work. It is the first and most essential operation of the work. Solve must precede coagula. There is no other sequence. Attempts to skip the dissolution, to build a new form on an unexamined foundation, to construct a more refined self on the bedrock of an unreconstituted prima materia, produce not the philosopher's stone, but what the alchemists called a sophic gold, a false product that resembles the genuine article on its surface but lacks its essential properties. It does not transmute. It does not endure. It corrodes under pressure. The temptation to skip the nigredo is powerful and understandable, and it takes forms that can appear entirely reasonable. The person in the midst of genuine dissolution, whose life, identity, or self-understanding is actively undergoing the solve, is subject to an urgency to reconstitute, to find a new story, a new identity, a new framework of meaning quickly enough that the period of undifferentiation is minimized, therapy that moves too hastily toward reframing, spiritual practice that substitutes transcendence for the necessary encounter with what lies below. New relationships entered into with the unconscious purpose of restoring, through the other's recognition, the self-concept that the dissolution has undermined. New ideologies adopted with the convert's fervor, not because they have been genuinely evaluated, but because the psyche requires a new organizing principle and is willing to seize whatever presents itself as available. The alchemical tradition is unsparing in its assessment of these premature reconstitutions. The work cannot be rushed. The prima materia must be adequately reduced before the subsequent operations can proceed. There are no shortcuts in the magnum opus. What is more, the tradition insists, and here it parts company with many forms of contemporary consolation, that the suffering of the nigredo is not simply an unavoidable tax levied on the path to transformation. The suffering is itself operative, the heat of the process, the dissolution of what one has been, the confrontation with the raw and unformed material of one's own depths. These are not merely things to be endured until the work is complete. They are the means by which the work proceeds. The fire that appears to be destroying the substance is the same fire that is purifying it. This paradox reaches its most concentrated expression in one of the most enigmatic images in the entire alchemical corpus, the Sol Niger, the black sun. The image appears in texts from the 14th century through the 17th, a sun that emits darkness rather than light, a source of radiation that illuminates nothing on the outer surface of things, but whose rays penetrate inward, into the depths where ordinary solar light does not reach. The black sun presides over the nigredo. It is the light of the underworld, the intelligence of dissolution, the form of understanding that becomes available only when the ordinary light by which one navigates has been extinguished. The black sun is not merely a symbol of suffering. It is a symbol of a specific kind of knowing that becomes accessible only in the depths of the solve, a knowing that cannot be reached by the operations of the ordinary intellect, by the deliberate pursuit of insight, by the accumulation of information, or the application of already held frameworks. It is the knowledge that the substance itself yields when it is reduced to its first matter. In psychological terms, it corresponds to what becomes visible when the ego's defenses are genuinely stripped away, not the nihilism that the ego fears will be found there, but something more ancient and more essential than the ego's organization, the deeper reality of what one actually is beneath the layers of what one has constructed oneself to be. The transition out of the nigredo into the subsequent operations of the great work is described in alchemical texts through a series of images that collectively constitute the albedo, the whitening. Where the nigredo is black, lunar, saturnal, and descending, the albedo is described as a first light appearing within the darkness itself, not a return to the ordinary surface light that was extinguished in the solve, but a new quality of illumination that arises from within the dissolved matter. The alchemists associated this phase with the appearance of what they called the cauda pavonis, the peacock's tail, an iridescent display of colors that rises from the blackened material as the first sign that the process is moving toward its completion. The chaos of the prima materia begins to differentiate. The formless mass begins to show internal structure. What was simply dark begins to reveal complexity. Psychologically, the albedo corresponds to the first movements of genuine self-knowledge that emerge from the depths of the crisis, not the self-knowledge of self-criticism or self-analysis, which operates from within the existing structures of the ego and therefore cannot see past them, but the self-knowledge that arises when the dissolution has been sufficiently complete that what was hidden becomes visible. The person in the albedo begins to see their own patterns from outside, to perceive the automatisms, the compulsions, the habitual distortions of perception and response that have operated beneath the threshold of conscious awareness throughout the period of the nigredo and, indeed, throughout much of the life that preceded it. This is not a comfortable experience, but it carries a quality fundamentally different from the undifferentiated suffering of the nigredo. It is oriented. It is meaningful. The chaos has begun to yield information. The alchemical texts describe what follows as a further stage of purification, sometimes designated the citrinitas, the yellowing, in which what has been revealed in the albedo is further refined, and in which the movement toward integration begins. This phase is associated with gold in its unfinished state, the color of dawn before full sunrise, the yellow that precedes the final red. It is a phase of preparation, of the increasing clarity and definiteness of what the dissolution has made available, of the gradual consolidation of what might be called a new orientation toward existence, one that includes rather than excludes what the nigredo revealed. The culmination of the great work is the rubedo, the reddening, the full arrival of the philosopher's stone in its completed state. This is the coagula of the original formula, the reconstitution, the new form that emerges from the fully completed dissolution. But it is essential to understand precisely what kind of reconstitution the rubedo represents, because it is not, in any sense, a return to what existed before the solve began. The lapis philosophorum, the stone, is not the original substance restored. It is a new substance produced by the complete operation of the great work that possesses properties the original material never had and could never have had without the transformation it has undergone. Psychologically, what emerges from the complete operation of solve et coagula is what Jung called the individuated self. But this formulation, clinical in its dryness, inadequately conveys what the alchemists were actually describing. The rubedo is not simply the achievement of psychological health, though it includes that. It is not simply the resolution of neurotic conflict, though it includes that as well. What the alchemists were pointing toward with the imagery of the rubedo, the red king, the solar gold, the perfected stone, is a quality of being in which the opposites that have been in conflict throughout the entirety of the process are held together in a relationship that is neither their simple synthesis nor the suppression of either pole, but something the tradition called conjunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites. The integrated individual who has undergone the full operation of the solve and the coagula does not emerge as someone from whom darkness has been removed. The darkness is present in them, but it is present in relationship with the light, held consciously, recognized, integrated into the totality of what they are. What has been transformed is not the prima materia, which is still there. The same raw material of impulse, wound, shadow, and limitation that was there at the beginning. What has been transformed is the relationship between consciousness and this material. The gold of the rubedo is not purity, it is totality, not the elimination of what is base, but the transmutation of it, its integration into a form of selfhood comprehensive enough to contain it without being destroyed by it. This distinction matters enormously because it marks the difference between a genuine understanding of what alchemical transformation involves and the pervasive misappropriation of spiritual and psychological language in contemporary culture in the service of what is essentially a more refined form of self-improvement. The replacement of undesirable qualities with desirable ones, the production of a better product through the optimization of already existing components. The great work is not optimization. It is something more radical and more costly. The willingness to submit what one currently is to a process whose endpoint cannot be specified in advance, and whose means involve the genuine dissolution of what one has taken oneself to be. The person who has genuinely undergone this process, who has been through the nigredo and the albedo and emerged into something recognizable as the rubedo, does not become someone for whom life is easier, in the sense of being less effortful or less painful. What changes is not the presence of difficulty, but the relationship to it. Suffering that was previously experienced as purely negative, as deviation from how things should be, as injury demanding correction, is recognized as potentially operative, as potentially material for the ongoing process of the work. This does not mean suffering is welcomed or that its causes are not addressed where they can be. It means that the encounter with suffering no longer carries the same quality of devastation that it carries for someone who has not understood that dissolution is law. The alchemists were also clear about something that is equally important. The great work is not completed once. The spiral nature of solve et coagula means that what has been achieved in one cycle of the work is not a permanent endpoint, but a new starting point. The lapis philosophorum of one cycle of the opus is the prima materia of the next. What has been integrated at one level of the process will be submitted to further dissolution at the next. The individuated self is not a finished product. It is a self capable of continuing the process, capable of consenting to further dissolution when further dissolution is required, capable of enduring the successive deaths and rebirths that constitute a fully lived life, rather than one that has been organized around the avoidance of dissolution at all costs. This has implications for how the person who has genuinely undergone the work inhabits their life in the world. One thing the alchemical tradition consistently emphasizes about the philosopher's stone is its transmutative capacity, its ability not merely to be gold itself, but to convert whatever it touches into gold. The person who has undergone genuine transformation does not merely become more capable of living their own life, they become, in some sense, capable of serving a transmutative function in the lives of those around them. Not through instruction or evangelism or the imposition of their own process as a template, but through the quality of presence that the work produces. A presence that can hold darkness without being destroyed by it, that can remain oriented when those around it lose orientation, that can recognize the operative necessity of dissolution when others experience only its terror. This is not a comfortable destiny, and it is not a celebrated one, at least not in the ordinary sense. The person at the rubedo of a genuine cycle of the work does not necessarily find themselves more at home in the social world, and may, in fact, find themselves less so. insofar as much of ordinary social life is organized around the collective maintenance of the fictions that the work has required them to dissolve. There is a specific form of solitude that accompanies genuine individuation, not the solitude of isolation or rejection, but the solitude of having moved to a place where the ordinary consolations of collective belief no longer perform the function they once performed. This solitude can be borne. It is part of the cost of the work, but it should not be romanticized. It is a real loss as well as a real gain, and the tradition is honest about that. The formula solve et coagula, then, is not finally a recipe for becoming a better or a more accomplished or a more successful person. It is a description of the actual structure of genuine transformation, a structure that the alchemists observed in matter, recognized in themselves, and encoded in their symbolic language with sufficient precision that it has remained legible across 6 centuries of cultural change. The collapses that punctuate a human life, the losses, the failures, the disintegrations of identity and meaning that arrive with their characteristic quality of seeming destruction, are, from the perspective of this tradition, not interruptions of the life. They are the life, or at least they are its most essential moments. They are the moments when the law is most visibly in operation, when the solve has its fullest authority. There is an old alchemical saying, quoted in various forms across several centuries of the tradition, visita interiora terrae rectificando, invenius occultum lapidem. Visit the interior of the earth, and by rectifying you will find the hidden stone. The prescription is exact. The stone is not above. It is not in the future, in some improved version of oneself that has not yet arrived. It is in the interior, in the depths, in the places that the solve has cleared, the collapses you have lived through, the dissolutions you have endured and are enduring. These are not evidence that something has gone wrong with the process of your life. They are the process. The gold is not on the other side of the fire. The gold is what the fire makes of what you already are.